Way back in episode 35, during the first year of Zilog and Moto, I did a video around the original Sega Genesis Mini, with the majority of the focus in the video being reviews of the two new games that were part of the US release, Darius and Tetris. And yes, at some point I should probably do something with my Genesis Mini 2 besides just sit and look at it on the shelf. But seeing as how the Genesis Mini 2 has a lot more than just two new games, I'd have to think about how I want to do that video, or perhaps videos. If you're not familiar with Sega back in the 80s, or you didn't see that episode, you might think, Tetris, that's kind of an odd addition to the Genesis Mini. I mean, wasn't that a Nintendo game? Well, that's certainly what Nintendo would like you to think, which is what led to the Sega version of the game only appearing in arcades and being cancelled before it could make an appearance on a non-Nintendo console, hence its eventual resurrection on the Genesis Mini. There's more to that story, but this isn't a video about Tetris, it's a video about Sega's attempt to engineer around being denied access to release Tetris on their consoles. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm out to collect and review not just puzzle games that possibly only exist because the alternative was legally denied, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. The Sega Genesis was a 16-bit monster with quality arcade ports and some certainly better than average sports titles out of the box. But for puzzle game fans, the Genesis didn't have an answer for Tetris, at least not right away. Yes, there was Zoom, which certainly isn't a traditional puzzle game, and there was Shove It, aka Sokoban, but I think it's safe to say that neither of those really matched up in style or quality to the game that had literally taken the world by storm. To the point where eventually the by far worst Police Academy film, Mission to Moscow, used the concept of a Russian-based video game being used to take over the world and actually have it make sense. Since Sega was blocked from having Tetris for sale on their platforms, the next best thing for them to be able to compete for that almighty puzzle gamer dollar was to come up with their own legitimate competition. The solution came in the form of today's game, Columns, which originally made its debut in arcades in March 1990 on the System C platform. And if you're not familiar with the System C, it's basically a Genesis with a few modifications that Sega used for games that didn't need the full power of the System 16. With Columns making a name for itself in the arcades around the world, the natural progression was to port the game to the Genesis, seeing as how it wouldn't require too much in conversion with the similarities of the platforms. And to answer a question of puzzle game fans of what they could play since they couldn't play Tetris. But was Columns actually any good? Is Columns not being the hit that Sega wanted the reason why the direct sequel, Columns 2, stayed in Japanese arcades and only made appearances on eventual arcade collections? Or is Columns possibly even better than Tetris in ways, and deserving of its title as a Sega classic? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the non-classic package. And this is my copy of Columns for the Genesis. I mentioned somewhat snarkily that this is the non-classic release of the game, meaning that it's the original release and not the budget re-release that came later. The reason for that is because for the Sega Classic release of the game, they completely changed the cover art, and now it looks like this instead, which is just awful. I have no idea what they were thinking, but this is essentially a heavily cropped version of the Master System art with a crappy logo thrown in. For every other Sega Classic release, the original artwork was kept intact. It was just inset in an either blue or red border, but not Columns for some reason. So now not only is it a red band release instead of the original black cross-hatching, it also has inferior art to boot. So hopefully now you understand there is actually a reason for that snarkiness. However, if you're going to be technical, even though this is the original release of the game, it is not necessarily the most valuable, because it is not the most rare. The Sega Classic version ended up seeing 3 different releases, with the last version coming out after Sega had made the switch to the cardboard box packaging,
And if you happen to stumble onto one of those, you're looking at a version of the game that currently sells in the triple digits to collectors, as opposed to the 10 or 15 bucks or so that the clamshell release versions go for. And just as an aside, the reason why I know all this is because for the first time in 222 episodes of Zilog and Moto, I had a bum cartridge when I went to go play the game this week, which is why I now have 2 different copies. Oh well, that's how it goes when you're working with 30-year-old tech. Just to finish the cover art discussion, the European version uses a version of that original art, but it's zoomed in, which cuts off the edges and basically ruins it, which is unfortunate. The Japanese art, on the other hand, is completely different, and it's definitely eye-catching, but it's also somewhat confusing. I think it's leaning into some of the mythology that they try to connect to the game, and again, it's not bad, but something about that original US artwork just seems cleaner and more iconic to me. Flipping over the back of the package, and we've got that original 1 large, 2 smaller screenshot layout that Sega used in the beginning, and while they're decent screenshots, there's just not a whole lot that you can work with when you try to present a puzzle game. The first line of the text leans into that Middle Eastern mythology that I mentioned, which as far as I could tell is totally made up just to give the game some sort of background. Someone please correct me if I'm wrong if that's not true. And the rest does about as good a job as you can doing to promote a puzzle title. Opening up the box, and the manual has some slight wear to it, but it's not too bad. Not a whole lot to say about the manual itself. It does a good job of explaining the game by going over the different game modes, and they included a ton of graphics to fill things out. This is one of those games that I think really could have benefited from a color manual instead of black and white, just to better illustrate the jewels in the pictures, but it is what it is. I do, though, have to call one thing out. At the end of the helpful hint section, there's only 3, and the last one is, you can earn higher scores by playing at higher levels. Gee, thanks. Maybe just scrap the helpful hint section next time. It's okay. Okay, that's the package. Let's try to match some jewels and see how Columns matches up to a certain other puzzle game. Before this week, I'll admit, I don't think that I'd played Columns in at least 30 years, and it's a game that I definitely never owned a copy of until I started this collection. It was a game that I never had any interest in growing up, and I'm pretty certain that the only reason why I ever played it was because it was one of those games that was included with the Genesis Classics disc that was shipped with the Sega CD, and I just loaded it up because it was there. I never seeked it out to purchase or to rent on its own, as I simply just wasn't interested because I'm not a puzzle game guy. And also to that point, I have never played its sequel Columns 3, so when I get around to reviewing that title, it will be 100% a new experience for me, so I'm actually looking forward to that. I'd like everyone to keep that previous statement in mind that I'm not a puzzle guy when watching this review. When I reviewed games like Zoop and Clax, twice, previously on the channel, I didn't exactly enjoy the experience, but I did try to be 100% objective in my views, and hopefully that came across in the videos. I'm sure that someone that really enjoys puzzle games of all types would probably have a slightly different perspective than me on what I'm about to say about Columns. So, for those of you that find yourself in that category, make sure to take what I say here with a grain of salt. Columns, like Tetris, Puyo Puyo, and the aforementioned Clax, are all what I consider a subgenre of the puzzle game genre, and that would be the vertical puzzle game. And maybe there's a more appropriate name for that subgenre. If so, please let me know in the comments down below. But for all of those games, they share one thing in common, and that there is a vertical playfield that is defined by a certain number of rows. The rows in the playfield represent all of the available space that the players have to work with, and the goal is to keep the playfield clear of tiles, puzzle pieces, gems, etc., and not allow those rows to fill up, with those pieces flowing into the playfield from the top of the screen and gravity bringing them to the bottom of the screen. Each of those games allow players to do that via slightly different methods. Tetris, the game probably most people are familiar with, requires you to fill up rows entirely to proceed. Columns, Puyo Puyo, and Clax all take a slightly different approach to that, because who needs an entire row, am I right? Instead, all three of those titles have you trying to connect similar color tiles, gems, and whatever the crap is in Puyo Puyo, and when enough of them are linked together, those things are removed from the board, scoring points and making room for more pieces. Essentially, if you've played any of those games, the logic of picking up and playing columns should be pretty straightforward. The Genesis version of the game has 3 variations to choose from in play, but first let's cover the arcade mode, seeing as how the game is technically an arcade port. When starting up the arcade mode, you're given 3 options at the beginning, and you can choose either easy, medium, or hard. The difficulty you choose doesn't really change how the game functions, but it does select which level you start on, and if you're given a bonus in points for starting on that level, because, of course, the higher level that you start on, the faster the game is going to move, and the more difficult it's going to be to try to line up the jewels. Technically, it can be argued that Clax had a similar feature to this first, as Clax debuted in the arcades in February of 1990, and Columns followed closely thereafter a month later, but in all honesty, this is a concept that goes back to at least Road Blasters in 1987. Regardless of the difficulty that you choose, the goal is the same. Try to match up these similar colored gems in a row, with a minimum of 3 gems required to make a match. Again, this is very similar to Clax, which also has players trying to match at least 3 colored tiles in a row, either vertically, horizontally, or diagonally. However, once you get away from the way the tiles/gems are matched, and the vertical nature of the game, the games start to differentiate a bit. With Clax, you have a much smaller playfield to fill up, and up to 10 different colored tiles to deal with depending on the level, and you're given each of the tiles one at a time. Columns, on the other hand, is more reminiscent of Tetris, in that you aren't given single tiles, you're given pieces, which all consist of columns. Get it? Columns, the name? Hey, you get it. Anyway, columns of 3 colored jewels. Sometimes you're given 3 of the same color jewels, sometimes 2 of one of another, and then sometimes they each can be different. The columns can't be flipped horizontally, because then that wouldn't be a column anymore, it would be a row, but you can adjust what order the colored gems appeared in before you place the column on the board. Each gem that appears in a column is one of 6 different colors: red, yellow, orange, blue, green, or purple, and in what I think is a nice touch, each of the different colored gems also has an individual shape, adding some much needed variety to the game board. While the concept of trying to line up 3 same colored gems together is relatively simple, and actually more flexible than you might realize at first, when you start playing the game, you soon realize that between being limited in only having vertically aligned pieces and having 6 separate gems to deal with, things can get very challenging quickly. And if you're not careful, and even if you are, once the levels really start to progress, things can get out of hand. Thankfully, arcade mode also has the presence of a wild column that will appear from time to time, and it works exactly as you might expect, with it removing all of the gems from the board that have the same color as the one it comes in contact with. As the game progresses, these will offer much needed reprieves, but they are also few and far between, meaning you'll want to choose wisely when dropping them on the board. And honestly, that's about it for arcade mode, which probably shouldn't be too surprising as it was designed to just be a quarter muncher for players to go after high scores, and not much else. Thankfully, Sega has also added 2 other game modes, Original and Flash Columns. Original operates in much the same way that the arcade mode does, however there are a few differences. You can choose what level you want to start on, up to 9, and if you want to really jump into the more frenetic action, there's also a separate difficulty level setting, which, rather than controlling what level you start on, sets the amount of different jewels in play, with either 4, 5, or 6 different colors being available. I'll talk more about that in a minute, because this is one of my favorite things that they did with the game. Finally, there's also an option to turn on a 3-minute time limit, which I think is another great idea, and really changes how you play, in that you're no longer necessarily trying to play in the most strategic way possible, you're really just trying to clear gems as fast as possible to beat the clock. The other game mode is Flash Columns. In Flash Columns, you start the game with at least 2 rows filled with random gems, and then one of the gems on the first row is flashing, indicating that that gem is the key, and your goal is to remove it from the board by any means necessary. This is a speed game, and with the goal being to get rid of that flasher as soon as possible. I thought this was a very enjoyable mode, and you have the option to choose a difficulty level for different gems, and how many rows are placed on the board for you to work your way down through. When playing Flash Columns, the first thing that came to mind was the variation of Tetris where the board is already partially filled, but here, with there being an actual goal to achieve, rather than just added difficulty, I felt more of a sense of accomplishment in the game mode for setting a record time, rather than just putting points on the board. One thing that I haven't mentioned so far is multiplayer. Of course, Columns can be played in single player with no issue, but all three of these game modes can also be played in two-player mode, with players competing at the same time against one another. Along with that, for both original and Flash Columns mode, the game also has a doubles mode, where players team up and take turns moving the columns into place on a single board. It's an interesting concept and one that I was not expecting, but I can also see how it would lead to some very entertaining party fights of players constantly blaming one another for screwing up, etc. From a graphical perspective, Columns isn't going to blow anyone's doors off. And I think that should be expected. I mean, it's a puzzle game. They're not exactly known for being wonders of sight and sound. But the game doesn't look bad, and I think there's a nice use of color and detail to the gems. As mentioned earlier, since the arcade board is essentially just a beefed up Genesis, it should be unsurprising that the game looks pretty much identical to the arcade, to the point of having the Genesis version have the exact same how to play demo included in arcade mode. The sound in Columns is very nice, if not slightly limited. And I'm sure I might get some complaints about stating that, but hang on, let me explain. Both the music and the sound effects in the game are great, there's no question about that. However, there's simply not a whole lot of either. Not having many sound effects makes sense, I mean, it's not an action game. But from a soundtrack perspective, there's only 3 tracks used when playing the game. Thankfully, you can choose your favorite before starting up a round, much like how you can choose your favorite radio station in Outrun. And all 3 background tracks are composed really well, I enjoy all of them, along with the other tracks that are used for the various game menus. But to me, 3 tracks just seems a little bit on the skimpy side, although admittedly, that's a nitpick. To the developer's credit, the tracks are accurately represented from the arcade version, and while the arcade version, when isolated, technically sounds slightly cleaner and brighter, you'd have to be listening very close and doing an A to B comparison to really tell the difference. Playing Columns this week was, I wouldn't say a revelation, but definitely much more enjoyable than I was expecting. I think the key here was the difficulty option in original and Flash Columns mode that allowed for having fewer colors of gems on the board. This changes things tremendously and allows someone like me, who admittedly just doesn't usually have the patience or mindset for puzzle games, to really be able to just play the game for extended periods of time, allowing me to get a better feel for the game than I normally would, which is something that Klax and Zoop previously failed to do. Is it a Tetris killer? No, but in the absence of Tetris on Sega platforms, Columns is at least a game that scratches that same sort of itch. As a result, I'm giving Columns 3 stars, and if I'm giving a puzzle game 3 stars, you know it has to be good.
Okay, and that's it for Columns for the Genesis. Columns, like Golden Axe a few weeks ago, is a game that I'm saying is actually better than the arcade version. However, unlike Golden Axe, which was measurably not as good graphically as the arcade version, Columns is almost a carbon copy of the arcade game, but that also has multiple game modes added, providing even more value to gamers than the arcade version, while not losing anything. If you're a Sega fan and you haven't played Columns, I definitely recommend giving it a shot, even if you're like me and not a puzzle game fan, especially if you have a second player to play with. I think you might have some fun. Next time on Zilog and Moto, it's the last review of the year before the 5th annual end of the year wrap-up video. Crazy to say that. I feel blessed to have been doing Zilog and Moto for the last 5 years. I feel like I've been able to provide a really good variety of reviews across these 4 Sega platforms over that time, and I've been able to connect with some really cool people over that time, both on YouTube and on the various social media platforms. is now if we could just agree on which one we're moving to after X Twitter finally collapses. For the last review of the year, I thought that I'd pull out something relatively obscure from one of the most notable publishers on the Genesis. Well, at least it was in the United States, as it was one of those releases that had completely separate versions in each of the 3 main regions. Will it be an ace? Or did the publisher fault and should it have stuck to action titles? Well, we shall see. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 222. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later!